Hi everybody, I'm very happy to be here and also to be following Wayne's presentation because I think it's going to be a nice follow-up to it. So this presentation asks about the trends in job stability in Canada over the last 40 years. And the focus on job stability here is intended as a complement to the literature on job security that focuses on work arrangements and firm practices. So here a focus on job stability is a focus on the career trajectory of workers. And so basically I'm focusing on the change in the career trajectories of workers in terms of job mobility and job tenure or seniority as we've, in a period where we've seen an increase in non-salaried employment and a shift in worker firm practices. Where's the click?
You want the clicker?
Well, I'm afraid, I think
Or
it's
I can just
No,
use
here,
this.
Have you taken the thing out?
No,
Yeah.
it's still there.
It's still there. Okay. You don't mind lending it?
Absolutely not.
Right.
Oh,
So I just wanted to acknowledge that this work with my colleague Denis Matissa Hollister at this hotel is funded by a presidential award from the Russell Sage Foundation. And so, all right, for the context. So we all know about the growing importance of non-salaried employment. Here, I don't think you can probably see it quite clearly. Any reference in red is a Canadian reference, or a reference on Canada, and the other references are mostly for the US and the UK. So there's been a marketization of the employment relationship and a decline in internal labor markets that promote job ladders and training by employers that is associated with a higher job security. In the public sector, there's been also outsourcing to contractors that's been associated with an increase in job insecurity, and workers are increasingly expected to have boundaryless careers, so careers that span the boundaries of a lot of several different organizations. And so in that context, we're expecting a decrease in job security. And so what happens in terms of the career of workers? So the early research on job stability in the 1990s were kind of inconclusive. In a sense that no significant change was found in job stability, even if there was some decrease for some subgroups, younger workers, men, especially in the US. But that conclusion of no significant change was mostly cautious skepticism in the face of some partial evidence because the changes were just starting to unravel in the 1990s. And so the more recent research in the 2010s that came back to that question in the face of new evidence on precarious work, for example, so some recent research found a decrease in average job tenure duration. So the average number of years somebody has been employed with a single employer continuously. And that's consistent with the expectation of the literature on precarious work and the transformation of the standard employment relationship. But at the same time, several economists have published papers that show an increase in job tenure duration and retention rate. And that's really puzzling. And they go beyond let's say a healthy dose of skepticism because now that the changes are well underway, so long-term trends in job stability can be observed. And so what these papers do is theorize the reason why job stability would have increased. And that's really counterintuitive. And this is what I want to address here, this contradiction in the recent literature and the trends in job stability. So there are several explanations formulated by these economists, so one of them is, for example, job stability would have increased because job match quality has increased, so workers have less incentives to leave their jobs, and workers have less incentives to lay off workers. Another one that's quite counterintuitive for anybody familiar with the literature on the transformation of internal labor markets is that the papers that find an increase in job stability argue that we're in a high-skill labor market where employers provide more training to workers, and that gives them an incentive to retain workers. And when you're familiar with the internal labor markets literature, you expect what has been found is an increased responsibilization of workers for their skill development and their employability. That's kind of contradictory with that theory. So what this paper does is trying to understand, trying to address that empirical contradiction, and then assess whether any of these theoretical statements or arguments can be supported in any way. Where this paper takes issue with the findings of an increase in job stability is that most of those papers do not account properly for important things that are likely to to show inaccurate results or to mask the trend, the actual trend in job stability. So first, we know that there's a trend in masked instability in the US and the UK, which means that the recent research that has found a decrease in job stability in the US has found a decrease for men that was masked by an increase in job stability for women, mostly driven by the fact that women are less and less likely to undergo separation after childbirth. And so that's an increase in instability among women for a reason that is slightly different than a change in the worker-firm relationship towards greater flexibilization. But when you focus on men and on women who don't have children, you see a clear decrease in job stability. So that's the first thing that needs to be addressed. That is absent from the research, the existing research. Also, economic cycles play a huge role in an economic downturn. Job stability will be higher because hiring is much lower. So within a firm, you have much less new hires. So more people are more senior just because there is no renewal at the bottom of the job tenure distribution by new hires. And workforce aging, more experienced workers tend to have longer job tenure durations. They're less likely to change jobs. And so if the workforce is aging, you'll see a composition effect showing an increase in job stability. So you need to account for the factors to get at a real trend or to really understand what's happening on the labor market. And also there's a problem around focusing on monthly or annual separation rates, and I will provide, it's going to become clearer as I show my results. So I used the Canadian Labour Force Survey, 40 years of data, so we can really get at the long-term trend in job stability. It's a huge sample, the monthly sample is 55,000. There's a consistent job tenure question from 1976, and to my knowledge is the only survey in the world that has a consistent tenure question starting so early. So I use a measure of job stability based on average elapsed job tenure duration. So a question that asks how long have you been continuously employed by your current employer? And you can also derive retention rates through that. So a retention rate is the probability of a worker who currently has a job that they will hold their jobs 1, 5, or 10 years later, for example. So these are the two measures of job stability I'm using. The second one captures more job security dynamics. So I include composition adjustments in all my estimates. So these are the estimation methods for the metallurgically minded people. We can come back to it in the question period. So this shows the change in average job tenure duration from 1976 in Canada. So if you see a downward trend, it means that the average job tenure has decreased, so it's a decrease in job stability. The line that really matters here is the lightest gray line that for men shows a decrease. So that's adjusting for unemployment, age, education. So you see that that average job tenure duration has decreased by more than 1.5 years, and the average at baseline was 8 years. So that's about a 20% decrease, which is quite significant. And so this paper is really the first one to show this for Canada using average job tenure duration. So that contradicts existing findings that argue for an increase in stability. For women, you see an increase in stability. For women, you see an increase in average job tenure duration, and that's consistent with the mask instability hypothesis. Now, this is the result for the 1-year retention rate, so the probability that somebody who currently has a job will hold it in 1 year. You see that the trend is completely different. The unadjusted trend in the solid black line shows actually an increase over the 1990s, stabilizing afterwards. And that's what's been used in Canadian literature to argue that, and they cite it very clearly, Leah Vosko is wrong, and they cite her, and they say this suggests that the precarious work is not a thing in Canada, and that actually the labor market is becoming more stable. When you adjust for the change in the composition of the labor force, so aging, education, it doesn't look like such a strong increase for men. And for women, there's still some increase that's consistent with the mass instability hypothesis. So one thing that is partially explored in the existing research, but I want to push this further, is disaggregating this trend by initial job tenure duration. So separating workers, calculating the retention rates, depending on whether they currently have 1 year of tenure or less, or more than 1 year of tenure, or more than 5 years of tenure. So divided in this graph. The scale is a bit different. So if you notice, the scale here is from 0.75 to 0.9. So here it's from 0 to 1. If the line was at 1, everybody who had a job in a given year would still have it 1 year later. So if the line is lower, it means that less people still have their jobs 1 year later. The solid line is the aggregate trend that you've seen in the previous graph, and the dashed line at the bottom is the 1 year retention rate for workers with less than 1 year initial tenure. So these are new hires. And so these are the ones who are driving the increase in job stability. So that's really puzzling. But new hires saw an increase, and that's the adjusted rate in job stability. And when you look with the scale, it's not so obvious, but there's a clear decrease in the retention rate among workers who have 1 or more years of job tenure duration, so not new hires. And also for those who have 5 or more years of job tenure duration, so quite senior workers. And you see that for men, for women, you see less of a change. Now, the intuition behind this paper, so these are partially new results, but partially already known by the existing research. So the intuition behind this paper is that the small decrease in job stability that you can see among longer tenured workers in 1 year retention rates, if you think about it, and that's just a back of the envelope calculation, but instinctively, if you're exposed to a slightly lower retention rate, 1 year retention rate, over the course of, let's say, 5 years, the cumulative effect can be quite large. So even if the 1 year retention rate decreases by 0.02 points, over the course of 5 years, if you're exposed to that rate, your probability of still holding your job will be 0.06 points lower. And so what I do is, in order to capture those cumulative effects, is to compute 5 or 10 year retention rates. And these are way more consistent, again, by initial job tenure duration. These are way more consistent with the trend that we found for average job tenure duration. So we see a clear decrease for men with all levels of initial tenure except for new hires. So that's one of the most important contributions of this paper is a reconciliation of the retention rate results with the average job tenure results. Now, just a quick analysis by sub. Am I yet?
You've got another 3 or 4 minutes.
Perfect. So disaggregating by initial tenure is interesting because the literature on precarious work, flexibilization, argues that workers who would have had secure jobs in the past are increasingly subject to a risk of job loss. So these workers are, for example, more senior workers. So in a forwardless labor market with strong internal labor markets, once workers reached a certain level of seniority, their level of job security was very high. And so the previous results here suggest that today workers with higher job tenure durations for more seniority are exposed to increased risks of losing their jobs. So that's one important part of the story. The other part is asking, well, what if we look at more experienced workers? So not just more tenured, but also looking by age. And what's interesting here is that you find different timings for younger and older workers. So among older workers, the decrease in job stability took place in the 1980s in a period of manufacturing sector restructuring and public sector restructuring in Canada. Whereas for younger individuals, the trend starts in the 1990s. So it's interesting to see how workers of different ages were affected at different point in times, and the drivers might also be different. This data can't really tell much about it yet, but future research will. The trends are also, so this is going back to the average job tenure duration models, showing the trends for public and private sector workers. So there's a puzzling trend for public sector workers and an increase in job stability over the 1980s, 1990s. It's probably due to a hiring freeze or a decrease in hiring in the public sector. But for private sector workers, the decrease in average job tenure duration among men starts in the 1970s even. So it's really a long-term trend. The decrease in job stability started a long time ago in Canada. So the last piece of evidence I want to show is the decomposition of the driver of the decrease in job stability for men and the drivers of the trend for women. So this shows the plain black line shows the decrease in average job tenure duration adjusting for age, education, and unemployment. And then the 3 other models, so the 3 other dashed lines, show the part of that change that is accounted for by a shift towards the private sector, a shift towards more on-account self-employment, and a shift towards part-time employment. What's interesting here is that part-time and self-employment are not really driving the trend. It's really a shift away from the public sector that's driving it. A limitation of the data is that we don't have a measure of temporary work, seasonal work. It only starts in 1997, so that would have to be for future research. But it suggests that, and that's a point also that was made by Wayne in his presentation, that the trend, the increase in insecurity and instability is not just driven by non-standard work. There's other transformations in worker-firm relationships that are driving the trend. So I do find a decrease in job stability for men starting in the 1990s. I reconcile the tenure retention rates results with the average job tenure results. And this is broadly consistent with the literature on the flexibilization of the worker-firm relationship. So it doesn't support the recent literature showing an increase in job stability and all the theorization of the reason why that would have happened. And it's kind of cut in the PowerPoint. The only puzzling part of evidence, which I will conclude with, is the increase in one-year retention rate for new hires. So why are people who just started working, who just started a new job, so why are they enjoying a greater level of job stability, at least in the short term? So it's consistent with what the papers showing an increase in job stability have said about the increase in the quality of job matches. So with job posting websites, job seekers have better information about the quality of the match or the quality of the fit that they will have with their new employer once they get hired. So in the short term, it might decrease the quit rate, for example, the destruction of initial matches. So that's one explanation that's consistent with the theories I presented at the beginning. But there are alternative explanations that need to be explored, and I haven't done that in this paper. The increase in the one-year retention rate for short tenure workers is happening at the same time as the decline in the fisheries industry in Canada, which is a seasonal industry with very low retention rates. And an alternative explanation is also that as more people lose their jobs, as the market is more insecure, the composition of job seekers is different. People who are looking for jobs are not just young job hoppers. They're also people who had built seniority and are looking for a new stable job. And so that might explain why less of them will leave their jobs. So I'll leave it here. Thank you very much.